Have you or someone you love been injured by someone who said that the Dreamcast controller wasn't absolutely incredible? Statements like, there's only one analog stick, the cable comes out the bottom. You may be due compensation from these damaging statements. The law offices of Tynology and Tynology will take your case. We defend the Dreamcast controller, and we will defend you.
Not a licensed attorney in the US or Canada. Call today for your free evaluation.
Yo, I'm Ty. If this is your first time seeing me, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, comment, tell me what you think. I have a lot to talk about today, and it's stuff that gets me really fired up because I see so much crap online about how the Dreamcast controller sucks, it could be better, all it needs is stick and analog, all this junk. Between you and me, they're all wrong. The brilliance of the Sega Dreamcast controller often gets overlooked and sometimes even gets blamed for the downfall of the console, which is just a garbage take. I'm here to tell you why this controller is one of the best controllers ever made and why it's even more ahead of its time than people give it credit for. Just like the console that you plugged it into. Let me take you back to 1998. These were the controllers that you could buy with the video game console. And this one, but we'll get back to that later. Ugh. As you can see, the options for controls were very limited. If you notice, only one of those controllers had an analog stick. Well, besides the DualShock. We'll talk about the DualShock in a second. Let's start with the analog stick. Now, when the Dreamcast came out, there was, on the market, there was the PS1, the N64, Saturn had been discontinued for a while. But I see it everywhere that the Dreamcast would have succeeded if it had a second analog stick because all the games used dual analog sticks at the time. Just flat out not true. It's not true. Everyone has a very distorted view on how games were controlled back in 1999, 2000, even 2001. 3D games were still very new. Platforming games, first-person shooters, none of them had a standardized control scheme. The modern controls with dual analog sticks for first-person shooters, I mean, there were a few games that trickled out. Rainbow Six in 1998 had an alternate control scheme that could use dual analog sticks. Alien Resurrection technically defaulted to the dual analog sticks, but the controls were so bad. The first game that really took advantage of dual analog sticks for first-person shooting was Time Splitters for the PS2, which came out right as the Dreamcast was getting discontinued. But even still, Time Splitters 1 wasn't really that popular. It wasn't until Halo came out on the Xbox at the end of 2001 that the modern control scheme really took off and what became standardized. You think about games after the Dreamcast was continued, like Grand Theft Auto 3. Go try to use the right analog stick on your PS2 with Grand Theft Auto 3. Games did not use two analog sticks at the time. That was in 2001. I think the first third-person game that used dual analog sticks was Soul Reaver 2, which came out after the Dreamcast was long gone. And the Dreamcast, we're talking about, came out in 1998. Maybe if the Dreamcast continued and didn't get discontinued in January of 2001, they would have released a version with dual analog sticks. I guarantee they would have. But that has nothing to do with how the system did before games were even using two analog sticks. You think about the PlayStation, the DualShock basically was not used. Ape Escape. People talk about, oh, it had dual analog sticks. You didn't use the camera on the right analog stick. You used a net. And you still had to use L and R to change the camera. It's just like Mario 64. And that was in 2000. It has nothing to do with the success or failure of the Dreamcast, though. The Dreamcast was actually very ahead of its time with the analog stick because it has a Hall effect analog stick. It uses a magnet to detect movement instead of a potentiometer, which means no stick drift. You know, if you saw my last video on the Dreamcast, you know how impressed I was with the modularity of the whole console? This controller is the same way. You take it apart, even this analog component is its own little piece that you can swap out and replace very, very easily. Second complaint you hear about is the controller's cable comes out of the bottom. At first glance, yes, that seems like a very odd thing, especially since they included a clip to pin it back to the top. Now, I did some research with this, and I've come to a couple conclusions as to why this was an intentional design choice, because there is actually plenty of room in here to have had the wire come out of the top. First of all, up until this point, most gamers held their controller more horizontally. The top of the controller faced the TV and the console. When the Dreamcast came out, they envisioned the controller being more vertical because you had to look at the VMU for pertinent information for a lot of games, especially since they wanted to push that. So having the wire at the bottom actually encouraged players to hold the controller more vertically. The second is you have a VMU and a rumble pack, or the jump pack as it was called for the Dreamcast. Those add a lot of weight to the front top of the controller, and so the balance would be off. There also is something that I discovered. It's kind of a secret tip with the Dreamcast controller. So you know how what a joke it is to roll up these old controllers? You'd always have to wind up the cable and then tuck the port through the last loop around, and it always made you cringe. The Dreamcast actually solved that. As you're winding your controller, as you get to that last loop, you can use the little clip to hold tight the end of your cable so it stays together. Now, next up, we'll talk about the buttons and the layout. A lot of people complain that there's not 6 buttons, especially since the Dreamcast had so many great fighting games. This was solved by the fight stick, which is one of the best fight sticks ever made. So I don't mind the 4 buttons. It obviously is the more modern layout that we see today. The other really neat feature is that the triggers are pressure sensitive. And if you look at the Dreamcast controller, it looks a lot like modern Xbox controllers. Every Xbox controller kind of took all their design from this Dreamcast controller. I love the way the triggers feel. It's a trigger that you pull down on. Now, would it have been great to play all these fantastic Dreamcast games with modern controls, with dual analog sticks? Yes, in hindsight, yes, it would have been great to play these fantastic games with modern controls. But that's besides the point. You can look at any game in that era. Look at GoldenEye. The controls of the time were the controls of the time. It was of an era. And so looking back and blaming that as something that was a problem, it wasn't at the time. It only is now. So I took apart this controller. One cool thing inside is that the D-pad, I actually really like the D-pad. It gets a lot of hate, weirdly. On the rubber membrane, it has a little plastic ball, which Nintendo used to do for their D-pads. What it does is it raises the fulcrum for pressing the different directions, and it reduces the amount of incorrect button presses. So when you push right, sometimes you'll push right down. Having that little plastic ball makes button presses more accurate. And I won't talk about the awesomeness of the VMU. I touched it a little bit on it on my last video, and I think I will probably do a whole video about the brilliance of the VMU, but that's for another time. Lastly, I want to talk about the ergonomics. It's one of the most comfortable controllers, in my opinion. I like that you hold it a little bit tighter instead of the arms out type of positioning that modern controllers have. It has that kind of speedboat look, and I was playing Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed and realized that you can play as the Dreamcast controller in boat form. It's rapidly becoming one of my favorite racing games of all time. Be sure to check that out if you haven't played that game. One thing I want to note is that first-person shooters, they work with the single analog stick. A lot of these games at the time, they were very one-dimensional in terms of verticality. The other thing is Sega released a keyboard and mouse that worked with all the first-person shooter games. And it worked great. It used modern mouse look and everything that you would expect from first-person shooters on PC. That is the ideal way to play these first-person shooter games, not with this. And I think Sega knew that. They knew that there wasn't a unified control scheme for those types of games. And so having that option made everything work. The last thing I want to talk about is the design. I love the design of this because I feel like it goes so well with the console itself. It has the same lines, with the circle and the triangle for the power. The lines just works so perfectly. I don't think there's been a controller ever made that resembles the same design language of the console as the Dreamcast controller and console did together. I'll throw out a few downsides just so I don't get hate. The analog stick, all being plastic with these little grippy things on top, that's not the best. And I wish it wasn't so concave. And the triggers do get a little springy after time. You hear them. This controller was kind of modeled after the Saturn 3D controller, which came out with Nights into Dreams. But it's nice to see where the inspiration came from. Do you think the Dreamcast controller deserves all the crap that it gets online? It drives me wild. Thank you for being here. Come find me on social media. I'm on Twitter, X, Instagram. Join our Discord community. I have a bunch of stuff coming up. I'll see you very soon. Promise. Cheers.